courtroom was bathed in an air of authority, its grand wooden walls lined with bookshelves filled with centuries of legal precedents. The American flag stood proudly behind the elevated bench, a symbol of justice that, for some, had begun to lose its meaning. The gallery was filled with spectators, journalists, and political commentators eager to witness what many had anticipated to be a brutal confrontation. Karoline Leavitt sat at the plaintiff's table, her posture composed, her expression calm, but her eyes filled with an intensity that betrayed her unyielding determination. The man seated at the elevated bench exuded confidence, the kind that came not from wisdom, but from years of unchecked power. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes scanning the room as if he alone commanded its fate. His demeanor was that of someone who believed himself untouchable, a figurehead who had long grown accustomed to wielding influence over the fate of those who stood before him. From the moment the session began, there was an undeniable tension in the air. It was the type of atmosphere that precedes an inevitable clash, the calm before a political and legal storm. As the proceedings commenced, his tone carried a thinly veiled condescension, a smugness that suggested he viewed this hearing as nothing more than a formality. His words were precise but laced with a quiet mockery, carefully constructed to belittle without being outright hostile. Karoline remained unshaken, her expression betraying none of the irritation that others might have displayed under such circumstances. She had come prepared, knowing full well that the battle she was fighting wasn't just one of legal interpretation, but of ideology. The questions he posed were not inquiries meant to seek truth, but traps designed to discredit, to cast doubt upon the legitimacy of her stance. It was a performance, one meant to reassure those watching that the old order remained firmly in control. Throughout the proceedings, there was an unspoken understanding between the two of them. He wielded his position like a weapon, allowing arrogance to dictate the pace of the hearing. The dismissive smirk that occasionally crossed his face was a reflection of someone who had long since stopped seeing his position as one of responsibility and instead viewed it as an entitlement. His words, while wrapped in legal terminology, were not about fairness but about ensuring that the narrative remained intact, that those who dared to challenge the established structure were met with resistance at every turn. The exchanges became increasingly pointed. Karoline presented her arguments with clarity and conviction, laying out the facts in a way that left little room for dispute. And yet, time and again, she was met with interruptions, redirections, and carefully crafted dismissals. There was no genuine engagement with the substance of her argument, only an effort to undermine and control the conversation. It was the type of maneuvering that had been used countless times before, a tactic deployed against those who posed a threat to the carefully maintained order. Despite the obvious imbalance, she did not falter. Her voice remained steady, her composure unbreakable. Each attempt to diminish her position was met with a poised response, one that cut through the thinly veiled attempts at manipulation. She understood what was happening. She had seen it before. This wasn't about the case itself. This was about power. This was about ensuring that voices like hers were kept in check, that challenges to authority were dealt with swiftly and with enough force to serve as a warning to others. The audience in the gallery watched with rapt attention. Some exchanged glances, recognizing the familiar tactics being employed. Others scribbled notes furiously, eager to shape the narrative in the court of public opinion. The cameras positioned throughout the room captured every moment, every expression, every subtle exchange of power. For some, it was a show, a spectacle meant to reaffirm their belief in the status quo. But for others, it was a reckoning, a moment that revealed the stark divide between those who upheld justice and those who merely wore its robes. Karoline sat unwavering, her presence alone a quiet defiance against the arrogance that sought to overshadow the truth. The game being played was an old one. It had been played before, and it would be played again. But what the audience did not yet realize was that this time, the rules were about to change. Karoline Leavitt sat still, her fingers resting lightly on the table before her, her face composed yet unyielding. She had allowed the charade to play out, had listened as the carefully constructed web of condescension and misdirection was spun around her. But now, it was her turn. She inhaled slowly, collecting her thoughts, knowing that the next few moments would determine everything. The weight of the room was pressing down, but not on her. She had seen these tactics before, and she knew exactly how to dismantle them. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady, unwavering. There was no hesitation, no trace of intimidation. Each word was deliberate, cutting through the air with precision. She began by addressing the so-called reasoning that had been presented before her, methodically unraveling the contradictions that had been carefully placed to corner her. The attempt to control the narrative had been blatant, but she wasn't, about to let it stand unchallenged. Piece by piece, she deconstructed every weak argument, every veiled attempt at undermining her credibility. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she let the power of her logic and the weight of indisputable facts do the work. The room, which had moments ago been filled with an almost theatrical sense of control from the other side, now seemed to shift. The dynamic was changing. She leaned slightly forward, her tone unwavering as she presented the facts that had been ignored. There had been an effort to dismiss her as inexperienced, to paint her arguments as emotional, rather than substantive. But she had anticipated this, and she had come armed with more than just passion. She had truth. Every point she made was backed by evidence, each assertion reinforced with undeniable reality. There was no room for misinterpretation, no gaps through which her opposition could escape. She didn't just refute the weak justifications that had been thrown at her, she turned them into liabilities. Every time a misrepresentation had been made, she exposed it for what it was. Every time an attempt had been made to redirect the focus, she brought it back with force, refusing to allow the conversation to be derailed. She was methodical in her approach, relentless yet composed. The gallery sat in stunned silence, some leaning forward in their seats, others glancing at one another, exchanging quick looks that betrayed their realization. This wasn't going the way many had expected. The cameras captured every moment, every shift in tone, every flicker of realization that washed over those who had entered this room expecting a different outcome. She didn't stop there. It wasn't enough to just defend herself, she needed to turn the tables entirely. She began pointing out the inconsistencies that had been deliberately ignored. She highlighted the hypocrisy, the double standards, the convenient oversights that had been weaponized against her. Each time she spoke, the weight of her words grew heavier, not because they were loud, but because they were undeniable. The dismissive attitude that had been directed toward her at the start of this hearing was now absent. In its place, there was something else. Discomfort. A realization that she wasn't someone who could be easily dismissed. The tone of the room had shifted entirely. Those who had entered believing that she was merely another challenger to be brushed aside were now watching a force they had not anticipated. She refused to let up. She pushed forward, not allowing a moment for retreat. There had been an expectation that she would falter, that she would hesitate, that she would allow herself to be boxed in. But now it was clear. She was the one in control. Every attempt to diminish her had only strengthened her resolve, and now the very tactics that had been used against her were crumbling beneath the weight of her argument. The silence in the room grew heavier with every passing second. Those who had been so sure of the outcome before this hearing had begun were now uncertain. The narrative had shifted, and Karoline was the one holding the reins. The power dynamic had been rewritten. The tension in the room was now undeniable. What had begun as an attempt to control the narrative had spiraled into something far beyond what anyone had anticipated. The weight of Karoline Leavitt's words had not just landed, they had shattered the illusion that had been carefully maintained throughout the proceedings. Every carefully crafted argument had crumbled under the force of undeniable truth, and now the air was thick with a realization that no one dared to voice. But she wasn't finished. This was not just about defending herself, nor was it simply about exposing hypocrisy. This was about justice, about ensuring that those who believed themselves untouchable were held accountable. She had spent the last several minutes dismantling every weak excuse, every misdirection, every attempt to dismiss the truth. Now, she was about to reveal what no one in the room had been prepared for. She reached for a folder that had been sitting beside her, flipping it open with the same unshaken composure she had maintained from the beginning. She had waited for this moment, for the perfect time to reveal what she had uncovered. As she held up the first document, the energy in the room shifted. Those who had been seated comfortably were now rigid, eyes narrowing as they tried to make sense of what was unfolding before them. Her voice remained steady as she laid out the details. The information had been buried, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and carefully worded statements. But she had found it, and now there was no escaping it. The paper in her hands was not just evidence, it was a reckoning. A single page filled with undeniable proof, the kind that could not be spun into something else. The silence in the courtroom was suffocating. The spectators in the gallery leaned forward, the reporters barely blinking as they struggled to process. What was being revealed? This was not just another political exchange. This was not a debate. This was the unmasking of something far larger, something that could not be ignored. She continued, placing another document on the table for all to see. This time, the reaction was even more pronounced. Gasps, quiet murmurs, exchanged glances. Those who had assumed she was merely here to defend herself were now realizing she had walked into this room not as the accused but as the prosecutor. The tables had turned completely. Every piece of evidence she presented cut deeper, exposing the truth layer by layer. The justifications that had been given before no longer held weight. The excuses that had been used to maintain control over the narrative were now meaningless. She had removed every shield, every barrier that had been placed to protect those who thought themselves immune from consequences. The room had grown so quiet that even the sound of a page turning seemed deafening. The reporters, who had entered, expecting a predictable outcome, were now rapidly taking notes, their headlines shifting in real time as they realized they were witnessing something far bigger than they had anticipated. And yet, she wasn't done. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes meeting those who had doubted her, those who had tried to diminish her. She didn't need to say it outright. The message was clear. She had seen through the game, and she had beaten it. The smirks that had been present at the start of this hearing were gone now, replaced by stiff postures and barely concealed discomfort. The weight of her words, the undeniable proof before them, had rendered every previous argument meaningless. There was no escaping this, there was no way to dismiss it. The room that had once seemed so controlled, so predictable, was now on the verge of chaos. For the first time since the proceedings had begun, the silence was not one of control, but of fear. Fear of what had just been revealed. Fear of what would come next. Fear of the consequences that could no longer be avoided. Karoline Leavitt took a slow, measured breath as she closed the final folder on the table before her. The air in the room was thick with tension, the kind that only comes when something undeniable has just unfolded. There were no more interruptions, no more smug retorts, only silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that wrapped around the room like a storm cloud about to break. She let the weight of the moment settle, let the reality of what had just happened sink in for everyone present. The gallery, once filled with onlookers, expecting a routine exchange, now sat in stunned disbelief. Reporters, their pens hovering over their notebooks, hesitated as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The story they had expected to write had changed before their eyes. A few whispers broke the silence, hushed voices exchanging hurried observations. The energy of the room had shifted entirely, and there was no mistaking why. What had begun as an attempt to discredit her had backfired spectacularly. She had not only defended herself, she had seized control, turning the hearing into an exposure of something much larger. She reached for a glass of water, her movement slow and deliberate. It wasn't a necessity, it was a statement. She was in no rush. The silence that had once been used as a weapon against her was now hers to command. There was no need to force words into the air when the truth she had laid out still echoed in the minds of those present. The spectators who had Arrived with preconceived notions, expecting her to struggle under pressure, were now questioning everything they thought they knew. This wasn't the story they had prepared for. The headlines they had drafted in their minds no longer made sense. The cameras, still rolling, captured every frozen expression, every nervous glance exchanged between those who now realized the game had changed. Slowly, she gathered her documents, organizing them with meticulous precision. There was no rush, no desperation. This was no longer a defense, it was a victory lap. Each movement carried an unspoken message. The work here was done, and the outcome was undeniable. The room remained still, as if waiting for someone, anyone, to regain control of the moment. But there was no path forward for those who had underestimated her. Every attempt to silence her, to twist the facts in their favor, had fallen apart. There was nothing left for them to do but sit in the wreckage of their own miscalculation. She rose from her seat with quiet confidence, her eyes scanning the faces of those who had sought to turn this hearing into a spectacle at her expense. Some avoided her gaze, others simply stared, unable to mask their disbelief. She had come into this room as a challenger, but she was leaving as something far greater. As she turned, the gallery erupted. Not with chaos, but with realization. Some murmured amongst themselves, struggling to comprehend how the tables had turned so drastically. Others sat in silence, processing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. The reporters, now frantically, revising their notes, knew they had just witnessed a moment that would reverberate far beyond this room. The cameras followed her every step, capturing the unshakable composure, the unrelenting certainty in her posture. She had done what few could. She had walked into an arena designed to break her and had left it stronger than ever. Karoline Leavitt didn't rush as she made her way toward the exit. Every step carried the weight of a battle won, of a truth that could no longer be buried beneath misdirection and manipulation. The room behind her remained frozen, its occupants grappling with the seismic shift that had just unfolded. The balance of power had been rewritten in real time, and there was no undoing what had been done. The reporters, once so certain of the angle they would take, now scrambled to make sense of what they had just witnessed. The controlled narrative that had been carefully set in place before this hearing had unraveled spectacularly, leaving only one undeniable truth. She had prevailed. Not through tricks, not through emotional appeals, but through sheer, irrefutable fact. Those who had underestimated her, who had assumed this would be nothing more than a formality, now found themselves in the uncomfortable position of reassessing everything they thought they knew. The smirks that had once filled the room were gone. The dismissive glances had been replaced with uncertainty, even fear. The silence was no longer a tool to suppress her. It was now the only thing left for those who had tried to break her. She paused at the door, glancing over her shoulder just once. Not out of arrogance, not to revel in the downfall of those who had stood against her, but as a silent reminder. A reminder that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, always has a way of surfacing. That power built on deception is never as strong as it appears. Then, with the confidence of someone who had just redefined the rules of the game, she stepped out, leaving behind a room for